David never expected to live with an alien. When he signed up for the intergalactic exchange program, he assumed his new roommate would be another human, maybe someone from Mars or a lunar colony. Instead, he got Salvera, a 7-foot-tall, blue-skinned woman from the Zephyrian Empire. From the moment she arrived, he knew this would be a disaster. She floated into the apartment, literally. Her sleek, high-tech suit generated a weak anti-gravity field, making her hover slightly above the ground. Her silver eyes scanned the small, messy apartment, and her expression turned to one of pure disgust. "This is where I will be living?" Salvera asked, her voice smooth but clearly unimpressed. David crossed his arms. "Yeah, it's not much, but it's home." Salvera waved her 4-fingered hand, and a small hovering drone emerged from her belt, scanning the room. The drone projected a holographic list. Unclean surfaces detected. Unorganized storage. Non-automated kitchen. 0 intelligent AI assistants. Salvera sighed. "Primitive." David frowned. "Hey, it's not primitive. It's just manual." "Exactly," she said, shaking her head. It didn't take long for things to get worse. Salvera immediately reorganized everything. Her drones cleaned the floors, stacked his clothes, and even tried to rearrange his kitchen. His old coffee machine was replaced with a glowing floating orb that she claimed could synthesize the perfect molecular drink. David watched in horror as his toolbox was lifted by a robotic arm. "Hey, put that down," he shouted. Salvera glanced at him. "These objects seem outdated and inefficient." "They're tools." David grabbed his wrench and held it up like a prized possession. "I use them to fix things." Salvera blinked, then laughed. A soft, melodic sound. "You still use manual tools. Are you a museum exhibit?" David scowled. "Listen, lady. Not everything needs to be done by robots. Sometimes, a little elbow grease does the job better." She did not believe him. So David made a bet. "Fine," he said. "Your fancy tech versus my tools. Let's see who fixes the air conditioning faster." Salvera smirked, clearly amused. "You challenge a Zephyrian engineer. Very well, human. Prepare to be humiliated." David grinned. "We'll see about that." "Look." As she turned away, Salvera noticed David's massive wrench lying on the table. Her eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing. She had never seen a tool that big before. David stood confidently in front of the air conditioning unit, rolling up his sleeves. Salvera, on the other hand, simply tapped a glowing button on her wrist, activating her repair drone. The bet was simple. Who could fix the AC first? David grabbed his trusty wrench, feeling the weight of it in his hands. He had fixed plenty of machines before, and this was no different. But as he worked, he could feel Salvera's amused gaze on him. "You seriously think that big metal stick will fix this?" she asked, floating a few inches off the ground. David smirked. "Watch and learn, space lady." Meanwhile, Salvera's AI repair drone scanned the unit. A soft beep sounded, and the drone projected a holographic display of the AC's internal system. "Identified issue," the drone chirped, releasing nanite repair solution. David frowned as a silver liquid flowed into the AC's vents, disappearing inside. "That's cheating," he muttered. "How?" Salvera asked, tilting her head. "You're not even doing anything." Salvera smirked. "Exactly. True efficiency means minimizing effort. Why struggle when technology can do the work?" David ignored her, focusing on his repair. He unscrewed a few bolts, wiped the dust from the wires, and adjusted the coolant system. Sweat formed on his forehead, but he didn't stop. Salvera, meanwhile, was waiting patiently for her drone to complete the fix. "Repair 90% complete," the AI announced. David's eyes widened. "Already?" Salvera grinned, crossing her arms. "Told you. Primitive tools are no match for Zyphorian innovation. David growled. He wasn't about to lose. He tightened the last bolt, made a final adjustment, and the AC roared to life. Cold air blasted through the vents. The apartment was instantly cooled, and David threw his arms up in victory. "Done," he shouted. The Zalvera blinked. She turned to her drone, which was still stuck at 90% progress. "What's the delay?" she asked. The AI responded, "System error detected. Recalibrating." David burst out laughing. "You mean to tell me your fancy AI malfunctioned?" He leaned against the wall, shaking his head. "And you call my tools primitive?" Zalvera pouted, staring at her drone as if it had personally betrayed her. This is an anomaly," she said, frowning. "Zyphorian technology does not fail." David grinned, tapping his big wrench against his shoulder. "Guess human elbow grease wins this round." Zalvera folded her arms. "That was just luck." David smirked. "Then let's make another bet." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh, you fix something my way, and I'll try fixing something your way." Zalvera hesitated, then smirked. "Challenge accepted, human." Hook. But neither of them knew just how messy things were about to get. Zalvera was not happy. She lost the bet, and worse, it was because of a human and his outdated tools. Zyphorians were known for their advanced technology, and yet she had been defeated by a wrench. Now it was her turn. David sat back on the couch, arms crossed. "All right, alien genius. You promised to fix something my way. Let's see if you can handle it." Zalvera sighed dramatically. "Fine. What needs repair?" David grinned and pointed toward the broken chair in the corner of the room. "That. The leg is loose. You're going to fix it with these." He placed a hammer, some nails, and a screwdriver on the table. Zalvera stared at them like they were some kind of ancient artifacts. "Where are the nanite stabilizers?" she asked. "No nanites. No drones. Just good old-fashioned tools." Zalvera narrowed her eyes. She was a Zyphorian engineer, one of the brightest minds in her academy. Fixing a chair should be easy. She picked up the hammer, holding it between two fingers. "It's heavy," she muttered. David chuckled. "Yeah, welcome to manual labor." She knelt beside the chair and carefully lined up the nail. Her delicate fingers trembled as she lifted the hammer. "Just hit it straight," David instructed. Zalvera took a deep breath and swung. Thunk. The hammer barely tapped the nail, and instead, she lost her balance and almost fell forward. David burst out laughing. "Are you serious? That was the weakest hit I've ever seen." Zalvera's cheeks darkened with embarrassment. Zyphorians weren't used to using physical strength, and her muscles weren't trained for this. She tried again, gripping the hammer with both hands this time. Thunk. The nail bent sideways. David shook his head. No. Let me show you." He grabbed the hammer and bam! In one solid hit, the nail went in smoothly. Zalvera gasped. "How did you?" "It's all in the wrist," he said smugly, handing the hammer back. "Try again." She huffed and adjusted her stance, determined to master this primitive technique. This time, she focused, copying David's grip. She swung with more force. Bam! The nail went in almost straight. David clapped. "Not bad." Zalvera smiled despite herself. "I suppose this is acceptable." Hook. But as she handed the hammer back, her fingers brushed against David's, and for a split second, she felt something strange. Something she couldn't understand. Zalvera sat on the floor, staring at her hands. They felt sore after using the hammer, something she never thought possible. Zyphorians were advanced, relying on machines and nanites for everything. Physical labor, that was unheard of in her world. Yet here she was, using primitive human tools, and somehow she didn't completely hate it. David smirked, watching her flex her fingers. Hurts, doesn't it? She glared at him. I am not weak. Zyphorian hands are simply not designed for this. David chuckled. Yeah, you did all right. But now, it's my turn. Zalvera grinned. Indeed, human. Let's see if you can handle our way of fixing things. She tapped the glowing band on her wrist, and a small spherical drone emerged, floating in front of David. This is an AI repair unit, she explained. It will assist you in fixing the broken lamp over there. David raised an eyebrow. I don't need help to fix a lamp. But that's the point, Exalvera said smugly. This isn't about strength. This is about efficiency. Humans waste time doing things by hand. Our way is faster, smarter, and effortless. David rolled his eyes. All right, fine. How do I use it? Simple. Vera flicked her wrist, and the drone beeped. Just give it a command, and it will do the work for you. David crossed his arms. That's it. Just talk to it. Zalvera nodded. Indeed. Try it. David sighed and looked at the drone. Fix the lamp. The drone's blue light blinked twice. Processing command. Scanning damage. Applying solution. A tiny compartment opened, and a thin laser beam shot out, carefully welding the broken part of the lamp back together. David's jaw dropped. The entire repair was done in less than 10 seconds. Zalvera smirked, impressed. David scratched the back of his head. Okay, that was cool. Zalvera floated slightly off the ground, her silver eyes shining with victory. See, your tools may be strong, but ours are superior. David exhaled. Yeah, but what happens when this fancy drone breaks down? What do you do then? Zalvera hesitated for a moment. We request a new one. David laughed. See, that's the problem. If my wrench breaks, I can fix it. If your drone malfunctions, you're helpless. Zalvera frowned, realizing he had a point. David smirked, pointing his big wrench at her. Tell you what, one more challenge. I'll use your fancy tech for a day, and you use my tools. Zalvera narrowed her eyes. You wish to continue this game, human? David grinned. Oh, I know you'll lose this one. Look. Zalvera accepted the challenge, but she had no idea how much trouble she was about to get into. Zalvera had never backed down from a challenge before, and she wasn't going to start now. Using human tools for a day, it sounded easy enough. How hard could it really be? She was about to find out. David handed her a power drill. It was heavy, with a thick grip and a long metal bit at the end. Zalvera stared at it, turning it over in her hands. This is what you use to make holes?" she asked. David smirked. "Yep. More power, less effort." Zalvera raised an eyebrow. "Then why is it so bulky?" David chuckled. "Because it gets the job done." Zalvera sighed. "Fine. What do I do?" David set up a wooden plank on the table. "Drill a hole right here." He tapped the surface. "Just press the trigger and push down slowly." Zalvera nodded, gripping the drill. She aimed the bit at the wood end. VRR. The drill roared to life, vibrating in her hands. Zalvera yelped, nearly dropping it. Her entire arm shook from the unexpected force. David burst out laughing. "Oh man, you looked like you'd just got hit by a shockwave." Zalvera's face darkened with embarrassment. "I was simply not expecting such force." David grinned. "You gotta control it. Use your strength." Zalvera huffed, adjusting her grip. "Strength is irrelevant. Precision is key." She steadied herself, this time holding the drill tightly. She squeezed the trigger gently, pressing the bit into the wood. The drill whirred, slowly cutting through the plank. Zalvera's eyes widened in fascination. "It is working." David nodded. "Told ya. Feels good, doesn't it?" Zalvera didn't answer. For the first time, She felt a strange sense of satisfaction. The drill was heavy, noisy, and inefficient compared to Zaforian tools, yet there was something real about it, something powerful. She finished the hole and turned to David with a smug smile. Perhaps manual labor is not as useless as I thought. David grinned. Told you. Now let's see if you can hammer a nail in straight this time. Vizalvera frowned. That was not part of the deal. David crossed his arms. Oh, I thought you wanted to prove yourself. Guess I was wrong. Vizalvera narrowed her eyes. You are testing me, human. David smirked. Maybe. Hook. Vizalvera grabbed the hammer and stepped forward, determined to prove him wrong. But she had no idea just how messy things were about to get. It had been a few days since Vizalvera agreed to David's challenge, and things were going surprisingly well. She had learned a lot about human tools, though she still thought some of them were unnecessarily bulky and inefficient. But there was something about working with her hands, feeling the power of the tools, that she found strangely satisfying. David, however, was getting more and more confident in his belief that manual labor was the way to go. He had even started teaching her how to use a saw to cut straight lines in wood, though Vizalvera had barely managed to avoid cutting off her own fingers. But that was nothing compared to what happened next. One evening, as they were both sitting down to dinner, a loud bang came from the kitchen. David jumped to his feet. What was that? Vizalvera stood too, her instincts kicking in. Her silver eyes flashed with worry. It sounded like something malfunctioned. David ran into the kitchen and froze. The oven had exploded. A small spark ignited a grease fire, and the flames were quickly spreading toward the cabinets. Not good, David muttered. We need to put it out. Fast. Vizalvera, who had been trained to deal with alien crises, immediately grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall. She aimed it at the flames, but when she pressed the trigger, the extinguisher sputtered out, not working at all. What the hell? David exclaimed. The extinguisher's broken. Vizalvera, panic starting to creep in, looked around desperately. She was used to advanced technology solving problems, but now she was standing in a kitchen full of smoke and flames, with nothing but manual tools to help her. Human, what do we do? David, thinking quickly, snatched up a towel from the counter and ran toward the flames. He threw the towel over the fire, hoping to smother it. Vizalvera watched, unsure of what to do. But David was moving fast, thinking with the quickness and resourcefulness that she had come to admire. Grab that pot of water, he shouted. We need to drown it. Vizalvera immediately obeyed, grabbing the heavy pot and pouring water onto the fire. The flames hissed and sizzled, and the heat from the kitchen seemed to dissipate almost instantly. David, panting and sweating, stood back, taking a deep breath. We did it. That could have been bad. Vizalvera set the pot down and turned to him, her expression serious but filled with respect. You handled that well, human. David grinned. Well, you were right there with me. We make a good team. Vizalvera nodded slowly, still processing the event. I've seen Sci-Fi technology do amazing things, but I've never seen it handle a fire quite like this. David shrugged. Sometimes you don't need fancy tech, just a little creativity and quick thinking. Vizalvera smiled, realizing that manual labor and quick thinking were two things humans seemed to do better than anyone else. Hook. As they stood in the kitchen, the fire completely out, Vizalvera looked at David with a newfound respect. She had always thought Sci-Fi tech was the answer to everything, but now she was starting to see that maybe human ingenuity had something special after all. After the fire incident, things between David and Vizalvera were different. They had always gotten along, but now there was a new respect between them. Vizalvera saw firsthand how quickly David could adapt to a crisis, and David saw that alien technology wasn't always the solution to everything. But the next morning, the differences in their cultures became even more clear. David was sitting at the kitchen table, sipping his coffee, when Salvera walked in, holding her datapad. She glanced at the messy counter and shook her head. "How can you live like this, human?" she asked, her voice tinged with genuine confusion. David blinked. "What do you mean?" "The lack of organization, the clutter everywhere. You humans do not have proper systems in place." She tapped the datapad, and a blueprint of the apartment appeared on the screen. "I have just outlined an optimal design for your living space, focusing on maximum efficiency. You must allow me to assist you in improving it." David raised an eyebrow. "My apartment works just fine." He looked around at the messy countertops and the stack of books on the table. "Sure, it's a little messy, but it's my mess." Salvera was clearly perplexed. "How can you function without the advanced systems I have on Sci-Fi? Every task there is automated, every space designed for optimal use. Your methods," she waved her hand around the apartment, "inefficient." David leaned back in his chair, setting down his coffee. "But that's the thing. Humans don't need all that stuff. We get by just fine without needing everything to be perfect. We improvise." Salvera blinked. "Improvise?" "Yeah," David said. "You know, use what you have and make it work, like we did with the fire the other day." He leaned forward, suddenly animated. "We didn't need fancy technology to put out that fire. We just used what was around us: towels, water, a little quick thinking." Salvera stared at him for a moment, still processing. "I see." David smiled. "Sometimes the best way to solve a problem is the simplest one." Salvera looked at him, then at the datapad still in her hands. Her people had always relied on their technology for everything, from their food to their homes to their personal needs. The idea of simply using what was available, without relying on technology, seemed strange to her. But as she stood there, thinking about what David had said, she started to realize that maybe, just maybe, there was something to human ingenuity after all. David leaned back in his chair and stretched. "You know, I think you could learn a thing or two from humans." She crossed her arms, smirking slightly. "And what would that be, human?" "Well," he said with a grin, "for starters, you could try thinking less and doing more. Maybe you'd enjoy a little mess now and then." Salvera raised an eyebrow. "Mess?" "Yeah, it's part of the human charm." David smiled. "It's like part of the adventure." She gave him a curious look. "Adventure? I'm not sure I understand." David shrugged. "Don't worry, you'll get it." Salvera stood silently for a moment, her thoughts drifting between the familiar comforts of technology and the strange freedom David seemed to find in his simpler, more chaotic way of living. Maybe it wasn't perfect, but there was something alive about it, something she wasn't sure she understood yet. Hook. The more time they spent together, the more Salvera realized that humans didn't just survive. They thrived in ways she couldn't quite explain. And she was beginning to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she had a lot more to learn from David than she had first thought. It was a typical afternoon when the Zyphorian embassy called, and the calm atmosphere in David's apartment suddenly changed. He was sipping his coffee, reading a book, when Salvera rushed into the room, looking pale and a little anxious. "David, we have a problem," she said, her voice tight with worry. David set his book down, concern flooding his face. "What's going on?" "They're coming," she said. "The Zyphorian inspection team." David's brows furrowed in confusion. "Inspection team? What's that about?" Salvera took a deep breath. "Every year, the Zyphorian government sends a team to inspect the living conditions of all intergalactic exchange participants. It's a routine check to ensure that our standards are being upheld." She paused, her eyes scanning the room. "If they find this place, like this, they will revoke my assignment and send me back to Zyphor immediately." David stood up, his mind racing. "Wait, what's wrong with it?" It's not like you've been breaking any rules. Zalvera's eyes flicked around the apartment. This room is disorganized. The technology here is outdated. The environment is unsanitary by Zephyrian standards. She looked down, clearly worried. Zephyrians do not tolerate imperfect living spaces. If they see the way I've been living here, they will think I am incompetent. David's heart sank. He had no idea the Zephyrian government had such high expectations. He thought they were just about exploring Earth, learning about humans and their cultures. But now it seemed like their systematic approach to everything was more complicated than he'd realized. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice full of urgency. Zalvera paced back and forth. "I have to make this place look like a Zephyrian living space. It has to be flawlessly clean, technologically advanced, and efficient." David's mind started racing. "So you want me to just, what? Put all the old human stuff away? Hide it?" Zalvera nodded. "Yes. Anything that might cause trouble must be disguised. The inspection team will be here soon, and we cannot afford to fail." David didn't waste any time. He grabbed the old tools, books, and miscellaneous objects and shoved them into a closet. It wasn't much of a solution, but it was the best he could do. Meanwhile, Zalvera ran around the apartment, activating the hovering drones that she had used to clean and reorganize before. "David, we need to look like properly functioning citizens. Help me," she said, her voice frantic now. David grabbed a cleaning cloth and began wiping down surfaces. It wasn't easy. Zephyrian cleanliness standards were far above anything he had ever known. He couldn't believe how much attention to detail Zalvera was putting into this. But then again, this was her entire future on the line. The doorbell rang, and Zalvera froze. "They're here," she whispered, her voice tight with fear. David took a deep breath. He didn't know how much longer they could keep up this charade, but he had to try. He had to help her. "Look." As the door opened and the inspection team stepped inside, David realized they were about to face the biggest challenge yet, and he had no idea how it was going to play out. David felt his heart race as the Zephyrian inspection team stepped inside. There were 3 of them, each dressed in sleek, silver uniforms that practically glowed. Their movements were precise, and their expressions were anything but welcoming. The leader, a tall Zephyrian with silver eyes, looked around with a sharp, critical gaze. "Zalvera," he said, his voice smooth but full of authority. "This is your residence." Zalvera stood up straight, doing her best to keep her nerves in check. "Yes, sir. This is where I've been living during my cultural exchange with Earth." The Zephyrian officer raised an eyebrow, his gaze scanning the apartment. David held his breath. He had done everything he could to hide the mess. The old tools, the books, the human-style furniture. But it wasn't perfect, and he knew it. The officer didn't seem to notice the little discrepancies at first. He walked through the apartment, inspecting everything. His gaze was cold and calculating as he moved from one corner of the room to the next. David felt a knot in his stomach. He had no idea how long they would be able to keep this act up. The Zephyrians were strict, and if they found out the truth about Zalvera's living conditions, she'd be sent home in an instant. The officer stopped by the window, glancing at the small plants David had kept near it. "Primitive," he muttered under his breath. He turned to face Zalvera. "This environment is substandard." Zalvera's heart sank. She knew this was coming. She had seen the look in their eyes when they entered, disappointment mixed with superiority. The Zephyrians had never understood how humans lived. To them, everything was supposed to be automated, controlled, and efficient. And here, in David's home, nothing was perfect. David couldn't stand the silence anymore. He stepped forward, trying to keep his voice calm. "We do things differently here," he said. "We like to be a bit more hands-on. We fix things when they break. We make things ourselves. Not everything needs to be perfect." The officer looked at him, his expression unchanged. "I see. But perfection is the foundation of Zyphorian existence. Your planet's chaotic approach is a misstep in comparison. David held his ground. Maybe we don't need perfection. Maybe we just need to survive. But we do it well. And that counts for something. Zalvera glanced at David, her heart pounding. She had never seen him so confident in the face of such criticism. Human resilience. It was something she had been learning about, but she had never truly understood until now. The inspection team moved through the apartment, continuing their evaluation. The officer seemed unsatisfied with almost everything, but to David's surprise, he didn't comment further on the mess. Finally, the officer stopped at the table where Zalvera had kept her tools and other Zyphorian devices. He picked up a small device, examining it closely. "This is an outdated piece of equipment," he said, holding it up. "Why are you using this?" Zalvera felt a rush of panic. It's human-made. I'm learning to use their tools." The officer stared at her for a long moment. Then, slowly, he placed the device back on the table. "Interesting," he said. "Perhaps there is some value in this. Primitive approach, after all." David held his breath. Did they believe him? Was this inspection going to be the end of Zalvera's time on Earth? Hook. As the officer finally looked at the rest of the apartment, his eyes softened, ever so slightly. Was it possible that the Zyphorians were starting to see something in humanity they had missed before? David and Zalvera stood side by side, waiting in tense silence as the Zyphorian inspection team completed their evaluation. The officer, who had been examining every corner of the apartment with a critical eye, paused near the table. His silver eyes moved over the tools and human-made gadgets that David had placed on display. "These objects," the officer muttered, "they seem inefficient, yet they are being used for something far more creative than our systems allow." David held his breath, waiting for the officer to condemn everything they'd worked so hard to hide. But instead, the officer turned to Zalvera. "Your methods are unconventional, but I am starting to see the value of this human way of thinking," he said slowly. "You choose to repair with your hands. You improvise. You make do." Zalvera stood still, her mind spinning. The officer had always seemed so cold, so certain that Zyphorian perfection was the only way. Yet now, he was acknowledging something completely different. David took a step forward. "Humans have always found a way to survive," he said, his voice steady. "Even without perfect technology, we get by. Sometimes, it's not about making things perfect. It's about getting the job done." The officer nodded, looking at him carefully. "Yes, I can see that. Resilience. It is a quality we do not always appreciate, but perhaps we should." David exchanged a quick glance with Zalvera. This was more than they had hoped for. The officer seemed to be softening. Could they really have passed the inspection? "We've seen the human spirit of survival firsthand today," the officer continued. "I was wrong to assume that this space was substandard. In fact, it is quite resourceful in its own way." Zalvera let out a breath she didn't realize she was holding. David gave her a reassuring smile. "You're telling me we passed." The officer didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned to the other members of the inspection team. They exchanged a few quiet words in their own language, and then the officer turned back to them. "You are free to continue your exchange," the officer said, his voice surprisingly gentle now. "This home may not meet our exacting standards, but it represents something valuable. The ability to adapt and thrive without perfection. We have much to learn from your people." David couldn't believe what he was hearing. He wanted to laugh, shout in relief, but he just nodded, keeping his cool. "Thanks. I guess." Zalvera stepped forward. "So I can stay?" she asked, her voice soft but full of hope. The officer smiled, something rare and unexpected. "Yes. You have proven that you are capable, not just of surviving, but of embracing new ideas. Your time here will continue, Zalvera, and perhaps you will show more of your Zyphorian brethren what true creativity can do." David grinned. I guess this means no one's sending me to space anytime soon, huh? The officer chuckled, then turned to leave. As he stepped toward the door, he paused. One last thing, he said. I would like to see what other innovations humans have made. Perhaps we can collaborate in the future. Zalvera smiled. I think that's a great idea. As the Zyphorian inspectors left, David and Zalvera stood in the quiet apartment, the weight of everything finally lifting off their shoulders. Zalvera turned to David. You were right. Humans do things differently, but maybe that's why you're so resilient. David shrugged, grinning. We're just good at making things work. Look. As Zalvera looked around the apartment, she realized that there was still so much more for her to learn. But for the first time, she understood that sometimes it's the small, imperfect things that make the biggest difference. And with David by her side, she was beginning to appreciate the human way of life more than she ever thought possible.